Grant, Illinois, January 28, 1918, 09:33. Captain James Holbrook watched through the training building window as 200 men marched across the parade ground in flawless formation. Their steps were synchronized, their rifles held at identical angles, their uniforms pressed, their boots polished to a mirror shine. They were exemplary soldiers of the American Army, disciplined, obedient, trained to follow orders without question. And nearly all of them were absolutely useless for what was now required. On the desk before Holbrook lay a report from France, delivered by military courier 3 days earlier. The document had been compiled by French General Henri Pétain after consultations with British officers experienced in forming assault units. The report was brutal in its candor. The main thesis occupied just one line. Traditional military discipline creates soldiers who wait for orders. Assault warfare requires men who do not wait. What followed was statistical data collected after 3 years of trench warfare. The French had analyzed dozens of assault operations and identified a pattern. Soldiers who completed standard training demonstrated two types of behavior when confronting the enemy in close combat. 86% froze, waiting for an officer's command even when hesitation meant death. 14% acted autonomously, making decisions based on instinct and situation. These 14% accounted for 91% of successful breakthroughs. The problem was that the Army could not predict who would fall into that 14% until a man was already in combat. And by then, it was too late. Holbrook turned the page. The next section was even more uncomfortable to read. A psychological profile of successful stormtroopers, compiled by British military psychiatrists after observing elite units. The characteristics repeated from case to case. High aggression, low empathy toward the enemy, ability to commit violence without emotional response, resistance to stress factors, risk-taking tendency, weak reaction to comrades' deaths. One British officer described it more simply. "We don't need gentlemen, we need predators." Holbrook looked again at the parade ground, where 200 impeccably trained soldiers completed their drill. Most of them were good men. Honest, well-mannered, patriots. Many had grown up in religious families where they were taught to respect life, avoid violence, resolve conflicts with words rather than fists. They had been taught to be civilized, but war was not civilized. And especially not civilized was the new, brutal form of warfare required by assault operations, bursting into a trench where the enemy was 2 meters away, killing in darkness with knife, rifle butt, bare hands. Seeing the face of the man you killed, hearing his screams, continuing to move forward when the comrade beside you was torn apart by a grenade, not stopping, not hesitating, not thinking, just killing, efficiently, quickly, without regret. Holbrook knew that most of the men on that parade ground were physically incapable of this. Not from cowardice, from normal human psychology. Studies showed that 80% of soldiers in combat fired into the air or didn't fire at all, unconsciously sabotaging their own actions because their brains refused to kill. 20% could kill. Of those, only 5% could do it coldly, methodically, without psychological consequences. The Army needed those 5%. The problem was how to find them. Standard military tests didn't work. Physical conditioning didn't matter. A strong, fast soldier froze in a trench as easily as a weak one. Intelligence didn't help. Smart men more often analyzed risks and refused to act. Even courage was an unreliable indicator. A man could be brave under artillery fire, but break when required to kill at close range. The only way to identify the right men was to create conditions simulating the very brutality they would face in combat, and see who wouldn't break. Holbrook picked up the second document from his desk Instructions for organizing a selection program, developed jointly by American, French, and British specialists. The methods had been systematized based on 3 years of European Army experience. Physical exhaustion to the limit, to remove self-control and reveal a man's true nature. Simulation of close combat using bayonets and knives against dummies, then against live opponents in protective gear. Response tests under chaotic conditions where receiving orders was impossible. Isolation and sensory deprivation to test psychological resilience, and most importantly, observation of candidate behavior in situations of moral choice, when one had to choose between compassion and effectiveness. The program was designed for 6 weeks. Expected success rate, 8 to 12%. What Holbrook did not know, watching those 200 soldiers marching in perfect formation under the winter sun of Illinois, was that in 42 days, 19 of them would remain. The rest would return to regular units, many with psychological trauma that would never heal. But those 19 would become exactly what was required. Not soldiers, weapons. Men capable of doing what a normal person could not force himself to do, even for survival. The mathematics of war did not ask whether this was morally right. It asked only, does it work tactically? Holbrook placed the report back on the desk and looked at his watch. In 20 minutes, these 200 men would enter this building for briefing. They would be told they had been selected for a special training program. They would not be told that most of them would be rejected as unsuitable. They would not be told that the Army was looking not for the best men, but for the most dangerous. The selection was beginning today. The American Expeditionary Forces arrived in France with a fundamental problem that no amount of patriotic enthusiasm could solve. General John J. Pershing commanded an army of 2 million men. But he did not command 2 million soldiers capable of breaking the German trench system. He commanded farmers, clerks, factory workers, and students who had been handed rifles and taught to march in formation. The British had lost 420,000 men at the Somme trying to break through with such soldiers. The French had lost 163,000 at Verdun. Both armies had learned the same lesson, written in blood across 3 years. Mass did not break trenches. Specialized violence did. The thesis that would define American assault doctrine was deceptively simple. Elite units could not be created through training alone. They had to be created through selection. The mathematics was brutal, but irrefutable. If 90% of soldiers were psychologically incapable of effective close-quarters combat, then training all of them was a waste of resources. The efficient solution was to identify the 10% who possessed the necessary psychological characteristics, concentrate resources on them, and discard the rest. This was not the mathematics of fairness. It was the mathematics of survival. What Captain Holbrook held in his hands that morning was the codification of 3 years of European experimentation, compressed into a systematic American program. The French had discovered these principles through catastrophic trial and error, forming assault units from volunteers, sending them into combat, watching most of them break under the psychological strain of close-quarters killing, then forming new units from the survivors. The British had refined the process slightly, adding preliminary physical tests. But both armies had done their selection on the front lines at tremendous cost. The American approach would be different. The selection would happen in Illinois, not in France. Men would be broken in training camps, not in German trenches. The psychological unsuitable would be identified and removed before they ever saw combat, before their failure could cost other men their lives. The system would be coldly industrial. Each candidate would be measured against specific criteria: physical endurance under extreme stress, decision-making speed in chaos, capacity for controlled aggression, resistance to empathy that might slow the trigger finger. Each test would eliminate a percentage of candidates. The tests would continue until only those who could not be broken remained. This was the mathematics that would transform American assault doctrine. It was more efficient to reject 180 men in Illinois than to bury 200 in France. The selection program that Captain Holbrook was about to implement did not emerge from American military theory. It emerged from European necessity, distilled from the most brutal laboratory in human history. In early 1915, the German army had faced a problem identical to the one now confronting the Americans. Their massive assaults against French positions had failed catastrophically. Tens of thousands of disciplined, well-trained soldiers had charged across open ground and died in windows of fire so dense that British officers later described the German dead as forming carpets of field gray. The problem was not courage. German soldiers were suicidally brave. The problem was that courage alone could not cross the killing zone created by modern firepower. German military theorists, particularly Captain Willy Rohr, had identified the fundamental error. The army was using industrial-age weapons with Napoleonic-era tactics. The solution required creating a new type of soldier entirely. Men who could operate independently in small groups, infiltrate enemy lines rather than charging them, and kill with speed and precision in close quarters. But Rohr's critical insight went further. He recognized that such soldiers could not be created through conventional training. The psychological characteristics required for this type of warfare: the ability to make instant life or death decisions without orders, the capacity to kill at arm's length without hesitation, the mental resilience to continue functioning after watching comrades die beside you. These were not skills that could be taught. They were traits that had to be identified and isolated. The German approach was systematic. Rohr established training camps where volunteers underwent a series of increasingly brutal tests. Physical exhaustion exercises lasting days without sleep. Live fire drills where men crawled under machine gun fire with bullets passing inches above their heads. Hand-to-hand combat training using sharpened training weapons that caused real injuries. Psychological stress tests involving isolation, sensory deprivation, and simulated combat conditions designed to identify men who would break under pressure. The attrition rate was devastating. Of every 100 volunteers who entered Rohr's program, fewer than 15 completed it. The rest were returned to regular infantry units, marked as unsuitable for assault operations. But those 15 were different. When German stormtroopers attacked at Verdun in 1916, French officers reported a new phenomenon. German soldiers who advanced in small groups, moving from cover to cover with tactical sophistication, who fought with controlled ferocity in close quarters, who did not break when isolated or surrounded. These were not the massed formations of 1914. These were surgical instruments of violence. The French response had been to copy the German model, but with typical French resistance to systematic process. French assault units were formed largely through self-selection, soldiers who volunteered after experiencing combat, who had already demonstrated they would not break under fire. This produced effective fighters, but it was an inefficient process. It required exposing thousands of men to combat, to find the few hundred who possessed the right psychological makeup. The British had taken a middle path. They established selection courses for assault units, but these courses focused heavily on physical conditioning and tactical training, with less emphasis on psychological screening. The result was units that were physically elite but psychologically mixed. Some men performed brilliantly in assault operations. Others broke at the critical moment, often with catastrophic consequences for their entire unit. By late 1917, all three armies, German, French, and British, had converged on the same conclusion, though they articulated it differently. The Germans spoke of innate warrior spirit. The French described natural fighters. The British used the term assault temperament. But they all meant the same thing. Some men possessed psychological characteristics that made them effective at close-quarters killing, and those men could be identified through systematic testing before combat. The statistics supported this conclusion with grim consistency. Analysis of assault operations across all three armies showed that approximately 10 to 15% of soldiers accounted for 70 to 80% of enemy casualties in close-quarters engagements. The remaining 85 to 90% fired their weapons ineffectively, froze under stress, or actively avoided direct confrontation with the enemy, even when ordered to attack. This was the data that crossed the Atlantic in late 1917, compiled by French and British liaison officers working with the American Expeditionary Force staff. The message was clear. The United States could repeat 3 years of European trial and error, or it could implement systematic selection from the beginning. General Pershing chose the latter. In December 1917, he authorized the establishment of specialized selection programs at 3 American training camps: Camp Grant in Illinois, Fort Benjamin Harrison in Indiana, and Camp Lee in Virginia. The programs would be supervised by French and British advisors with combat experience in assault operations. The goal was to create American assault units that could match German stormtroopers in effectiveness without requiring years of combat experience to identify suitable personnel. The European template was brutal in its simplicity. Test candidates under conditions that simulated combat stress. Eliminate those who broke. Continue testing the survivors under progressively more severe conditions. Eliminate those who broke. Repeat until only those who could not be broken remained. The assumption underlying this process was as radical as it was disturbing. The capacity for effective combat violence was not distributed equally across the male population. It was a trait found in a small minority, and that minority could be identified through systematic stress testing. Captain Holbrook, standing in that training building at Camp Grant in January 1918, was about to become the American interpreter of this European lesson. The 200 men marching on the parade ground outside represented the raw material. The selection program would be the filter, and the mathematics would be merciless. The briefing room at Camp Grant had been deliberately left unheated despite the January cold. The 200 candidates filed in at 10 hours, their breath visible in the frigid air. They arranged themselves in neat rows, standing at attention, demonstrating the discipline instilled by basic training. Captain Holbrook entered, accompanied by a French officer, Captain Georges Duval, and a British lieutenant, Charles Morrison. Both Europeans wore ribbons indicating combat service. Both had the particular expression that men acquired after extended time in the trenches, a flatness in the eyes that suggested they had seen things that could not be adequately described to those who had not shared the experience. Holbrook's opening statement was brief. The candidates had been selected as potential members of specialized assault units. The training would be demanding. Not all would complete it. Those who did would receive additional pay and the privilege of wearing distinctive insignia. Those who did not would return to regular infantry units without prejudice. What Holbrook did not say, because the candidates were not yet ready to hear it, was that the selection process had already begun. French and British advisors had insisted on this approach. Every aspect of the program, from the cold room to the timing of meals to the manner in which orders were given, was designed to create stress and observe response. The candidates did not know they were already being tested. They did not know that Captain Duval and Lieutenant Morrison were not there to teach. They were there to evaluate. And they did not know that the simple act of standing at attention in a cold room for 30 minutes while Holbrook reviewed administrative details was the first filter. By the time the briefing ended, both European officers had made preliminary notes. 17 men had shifted their weight repeatedly, indicating low pain tolerance or weak discipline. 9 had allowed their attention to wander, glancing around the room rather than maintaining focus forward. 3 had visibly shivered despite their heavy uniforms, suggesting poor physical conditioning or low cold tolerance. These observations were recorded in individual files that would accumulate data throughout the 6-week program. No single observation would eliminate a candidate. But patterns would emerge, and patterns would determine who continued and who was sent back. The first physical test began that afternoon. The candidates were formed into groups of 20 and led to an obstacle course constructed according to French specifications. The course was not designed to test athletic ability. It was designed to test response to physical stress under time pressure with inadequate information. Each group received identical instructions. Complete the course in under 12 minutes. No explanation of what completing meant. No demonstration of proper technique. No clarification when candidates asked questions. The instructions were deliberately vague, forcing each man to make decisions with incomplete information. Exactly the situation they would face in combat. The course itself was brutal. A 300-meter sprint to a water obstacle. A creek widened and deepened to chest height in the January cold. No bridge, no rope, no clear crossing point. The candidates had to decide whether to wade through the icy water or search for an alternative. Then, a climb over a 12-foot wall with minimal handholds. Then a crawl through 100 meters of mud under barbed wire. Then a sprint to a trench system where they had to locate and retrieve a marker flag whose location they had not been told. The French and British observers positioned themselves at key points along the course, watching not who finished fastest, but how each man responded to ambiguity and discomfort. The results were revealing. 43 candidates refused to enter the icy water, searching instead for a way around it. They were eliminating themselves, though they did not yet know it. Combat would not offer ways around obstacles. Men who sought comfort over mission completion were unsuitable for assault operations. 67 candidates asked for clarification or assistance at various points on the course, calling out to instructors for guidance. They too were marking themselves as dependent on external direction, exactly the trait that assault warfare could not accommodate. 31 candidates gave up entirely, walking off the course before completion. Some cited injury, turned ankles, pulled muscles, exhaustion. Most were lying, seeking an honorable way to quit. The medical officer examined each claimant. Only 4 had injuries severe enough to justify stopping. The remaining 27 were noted in the files. That left 59 men who completed the course without requesting help, without seeking easier paths, and without quitting. These 59 became the focus of intensified observation. The second day introduced sleep deprivation. The candidates were roused at 0200 hours and ordered to full gear assembly and inspection on the parade ground. The inspection was meticulous and lengthy, lasting until 0500 hours. Then breakfast, followed immediately by a 12-mile march with full equipment. Then weapons drills. Then another obstacle course, this one incorporating live fire. French instructors firing rifle rounds over the heads of crawling candidates. Then hand-to-hand combat practice, then evening mess. Then another inspection at 2200 hours. Then 2 hours of sleep before the cycle repeated. This schedule continued for 5 days. The purpose was not physical conditioning, though the physical demands were severe. The purpose was to remove the protective buffer of adequate rest and reveal each man's core temperament under degraded cognitive function. Sleep deprivation affected different men differently. Some became irritable and aggressive, snapping at fellow candidates, picking fights over trivial matters. These men were noted as potentially suitable, provided the aggression remained controllable. Some became withdrawn and uncommunicative, sitting alone during meals, avoiding interaction. These men were noted as psychologically isolating under stress, a trait that could be either beneficial or problematic depending on other factors. Some became emotionally unstable, breaking down in tears, expressing hopelessness, questioning their decision to volunteer. These men were quietly removed from the program. By the end of the first week, 34 candidates had been eliminated. They were transferred to other units without ceremony or explanation. The remaining 166 were allowed a full night's sleep, then informed the next phase of selection would begin the following morning. Captain Duval addressed them through an interpreter. His message was characteristically blunt. The initial phase had identified those who lacked basic physical and mental resilience. What remained was to identify those who possessed the specific psychological characteristics required for assault warfare. The upcoming tests would be severe. Some candidates would be injured. Some would request removal from the program. Some would be removed involuntarily based on observed behavior. This was not a punishment. It was a recognition that different men were suited for different types of service. What Duval did not explain was the specific nature of the tests. The candidates would learn through experience, and experience would eliminate most of them. The second week began with an exercise that had no precedent in American military training. The candidates were divided into groups of 8 and led to a training area where a series of trenches had been excavated according to exact German specifications. The trenches were narrow, deliberately claustrophobic, with multiple turns and dead ends. Smoke generators had been positioned throughout the trench system, filling the passages with thick, acrid fog that reduced visibility to less than 2 meters. Each group received identical equipment: training bayonets, dulled but still capable of inflicting painful bruises, and instructions to clear the trench. What constituted clearing was not explained. How to do so was not demonstrated. The groups were simply ordered into the smoke-filled trenches with the understanding that instructors were positioned somewhere inside, acting as enemy defenders. The first group entered the trench system at 09:15. They emerged 12 minutes later, having advanced approximately 40 meters into the 200-meter system before stopping. None of the instructors inside had been engaged. When questioned, the group leader explained they had been unable to locate the enemy in the smoke and had decided to withdraw rather than risk advancing into an ambush. The response from Lieutenant Morrison was cold. He informed them they had failed. In actual combat, Germans would not wait for Americans to locate them comfortably. They would attack through the smoke. Withdrawing was not an option unless ordered. The group was marked for elimination. The second group's performance was different. They advanced aggressively, moving quickly through the smoke-filled passages. When they encountered an instructor in the role of enemy defender, they attacked immediately with their training bayonets. The violence of their assault surprised the instructor, a British veteran who had trained assault units. One candidate, a former Michigan farmhand named Robert Keller, struck with such force that he knocked the instructor to the ground and continued striking until pulled off by his teammates. The instructor suffered 3 broken ribs. The group was marked for continuation. Keller specifically was noted as demonstrating appropriate aggression for close-quarters combat. This distinction between groups that hesitated and groups that attacked immediately, was precisely what the test was designed to reveal. Over the next 3 days, every remaining candidate went through some version of the trench clearing exercise. Some variations involved live instructors. Some involved mannequins that dropped from concealed positions. Some involved no targets at all, testing whether groups would maintain aggression even when uncertain if enemies were present. The performance patterns were stark. Approximately 70% of candidates, when confronted with an ambiguous situation in smoke-filled trenches, defaulted to caution. They advanced slowly, called out challenges, attempted to assess the situation before acting. These were reasonable, rational responses. They were also completely unsuitable for assault warfare, where hesitation meant death. 30% attacked first and assessed afterward. They moved through the trenches at near sprinting speed, struck anything that moved, and continued advancing even when uncertain what lay ahead. Several candidates injured instructors. 2 injured fellow candidates in the confusion and smoke. One, a former Boston dock worker named Thomas Chen, attacked so ferociously that he had to be physically restrained after the exercise ended, having entered a state of focused aggression that he could not immediately exit. The 70% who hesitated were removed from the program. This single exercise eliminated 116 candidates. The mathematics was brutal, but the logic was irrefutable. Men who needed time to decide whether to fight would die in the 3-second window when a German stormtrooper emerged from the smoke of a shelled trench. The 30% who remained, 50 men, became subjects of intensified scrutiny. They had demonstrated the first essential characteristic, the capacity for immediate, overwhelming violence. What remained was to test whether that violence could be controlled and directed. Aggression without discipline was not useful to the army. A soldier who attacked everything indiscriminately was as dangerous to his own unit as to the enemy. The next phase of selection focused on identifying men who could toggle between extreme violence and calm control, who could be savage when required and restrained when ordered. The test designed to measure this quality was, according to French advisors, the most reliable predictor of success in assault operations. It required candidates to perform contradictory tasks in rapid sequence under stress conditions. The exercise began at 05 Hunty hours on the 9th day. The 50 remaining candidates were awakened and led to a training field where a complex obstacle course had been constructed overnight. The course incorporated elements that required both physical violence and fine motor control. A candidate would sprint 50 meters, attack a mannequin with maximum force using a training rifle as a club, then immediately transition to a task requiring precision, disassembling and reassembling a rifle with cold, shaking hands. Then sprint again, crawl under barbed wire, attack another mannequin, then thread needles with trembling fingers. Then scale a wall, attack a target. Then write a brief report documenting what they had just done. The genius of the test lay in its impossibility. The exercises demanding maximum aggression elevated heart rate, flooded the bloodstream with adrenaline, and triggered the body's fight-or-flight response. The exercises demanding fine motor control required calm, steady hands and regulated breathing, physiological states incompatible with the aggressive state. Most candidates could not make the transition. They would attack the mannequins effectively, then fail completely at the precision tasks, dropping rifle components, breaking needles, writing illegible reports. Their bodies remained in an aggressive state even when their minds tried to shift to calm. 17 men demonstrated the ability to toggle between states. They attacked with appropriate ferocity, then visibly forced themselves to slow their breathing, steady their hands, and complete the precision tasks. Several of these men had prior experience that explained the capability. Robert Keller, the Michigan farmhand who had broken the instructor's ribs, had spent years working with livestock, experience that taught rapid transitions between forceful animal handling and delicate equipment repair. Thomas Chen, the Boston dock worker, had worked loading cargo holds, where a moment of inattention could crush a man. But speed was essential for economic survival. These 17 became the core group around which American assault doctrine would be built. They possessed the fundamental psychological duality required for effective stormtroopers, the capacity for controlled savagery. But 17 men out of an initial 200 was an insufficient number. Captain Holbrook had been instructed to deliver at least 20 qualified candidates from each training camp. The standards could not be lowered. Sending unsuitable men into assault operations was a death sentence for them and their units. The solution was to expand the initial recruitment pool. Orders went out to surrounding camps. Another 100 volunteers were requested, with specific instructions regarding the type of men to send. Combat veterans, if available, men with documented aggressive behavior, individuals with backgrounds suggesting comfort with violence, former boxers, law enforcement officers, men with criminal records for assault who had been allowed to enlist rather than face prosecution. This second wave arrived at Camp Grant on day 12 of the program. They were informed they would undergo an accelerated version of the selection course, 2 weeks compressed into one. The attrition rate would necessarily be higher, but time pressure was mounting. Pershing needed trained assault units in France by May. The accelerated program eliminated pretense. There was no gradual introduction to stress conditions. The new candidates were subjected to the most severe tests immediately. Those who broke were removed the same day. Those who showed promise continued to increasingly brutal exercises. One test, introduced during the accelerated program and later adopted as standard, involved placing candidates in a pit with a German shepherd trained to attack on command. The candidate was given a wooden stick and instructed to defend himself. The dog would be released. The candidate had to simultaneously protect himself and demonstrate controlled response, striking the dog hard enough to discourage attack, but not hard enough to injure it severely. The test revealed multiple factors simultaneously. Physical courage, whether the man would face the attacking dog or attempt to flee. Controlled aggression, whether he would strike effectively or panic and flail ineffectively. Most critically, it revealed whether the candidate could maintain enough cognitive function under stress to modulate his violence according to rules of engagement. Killing the dog meant elimination. Allowing the dog to bite without resistance meant elimination. The acceptable response was controlled violence, hard, fast, precise strikes that neutralized the threat without exceeding necessary force. 43 of the 100 new candidates failed this test. They either fled from the dog, struck ineffectively, or beat the animal with such ferocity that handlers had to intervene. These 43 were returned to their original units the same day. The remaining 57 continued to the next phase, tests designed to measure their capacity to inflict violence on human targets. The question that haunted military psychologists studying assault warfare was deceptively simple. Why did most soldiers not kill? Analysis of combat after-action reports from all armies revealed a disturbing pattern. In engagements where soldiers had clear opportunities to fire at enemy targets, only a minority actually aimed to hit. Most fired in the general direction of the enemy, or deliberately aimed high, or found reasons not to fire at all. The explanations varied. Some researchers attributed it to inadequate training. Others cited religious or moral conditioning against killing. Still others suggested most men simply lacked the killer instinct. A term that meant nothing scientifically, but captured the observed phenomenon that some men could pull the trigger on a human target, while most could not. By late 1917, French psychologists had developed a theory that would profoundly influence American selection doctrine. They proposed that the capacity to kill was not evenly distributed across the male population, but existed on a spectrum. At one end were men constitutionally incapable of killing except in immediate self-defense. They would literally rather die than deliberately end another human's life. At the other end were men who experienced no psychological resistance to killing, who could shoot, stab, or beat an enemy to death with the same emotional response they brought to any other physical task. The French estimated, based on observation of thousands of combat soldiers, that the distribution was roughly 10% absolute non-killers, 20% effective killers, and 70% who could be trained to kill under specific circumstances but remained psychologically conflicted about it. Assault warfare required men from the 20%. Training could not move a man from one category to another. The categories reflected fundamental personality structures formed long before military service. The task of selection was to identify which category each candidate occupied and allocate men accordingly. The final phase of the Camp Grant selection program was designed to make this determination. It required candidates to engage in simulated close-quarters combat against realistic human targets, not mannequins, but live opponents in protective gear who fought back. The exercise was structured as follows. Each candidate would enter a maze-like structure representing a captured German bunker system. Inside, instructors wearing heavy protective padding and headgear would act as enemy soldiers. The candidate carried a training rifle with a weighted bayonet, dull but heavy enough to deliver painful strikes through padding. The objective was simple: clear the structure room by room, neutralizing all enemy combatants. What made the exercise psychologically revealing was the realism of the opposition. The instructors fought back with appropriate ferocity. They shouted in German. They struck candidates with padding-covered clubs. They created the psychological experience of actual combat as closely as training conditions permitted. The candidates' responses varied along a spectrum that confirmed the French theory. Some candidates advanced into the structure but could not bring themselves to strike the instructors with full force, despite knowing the protective gear prevented serious injury. They would grapple ineffectively, push rather than strike, call out for the instructor to surrender. These men were psychologically incapable of committing violence against a human-shaped target, even in training. They were removed from the program. Some candidates struck effectively, but showed visible distress afterward, shaking hands, elevated breathing, expressions suggesting psychological conflict about what they had just done. These men could kill if required, but it would cost them psychologically. They were suitable for regular infantry, but not for assault units that required repeated close-quarters killing without psychological degradation. The final group, 19 men from the original program and 14 from the accelerated program, struck with immediate, overwhelming force and showed no subsequent distress. When they entered a room containing an instructor in protective gear, they attacked instantly, delivering maximum force strikes to disable the target as quickly as possible, then moved immediately to the next room without pause. When interviewed afterward, their descriptions of the exercise were matter-of-fact. They had neutralized threats. They felt no particular emotion about having done so. These 33 men were what the program had been designed to find, men for whom combat violence was not traumatic or morally conflicted, but simply operational. Men who could kill efficiently and repeatedly without psychological breakdown. Captain Holbrook, observing the exercise from an elevated position, recognized he was watching something that would have been unthinkable in the American military establishment just 5 years earlier. The army was systematically identifying and cultivating the capacity for human predation. It was sorting men not by their virtues, courage, loyalty, patriotism, but by their effectiveness as instruments of close-quarters killing. The moral implications were staggering, but the tactical implications were undeniable. When these men deployed to France, they would face German stormtroopers who had been selected through identical processes. The question was not whether such selection was ethical. The question was whether the United States would field comparable forces or allow its soldiers to be slaughtered by an enemy who had already learned these lessons. Pershing had made the decision. Ethics would be subordinated to effectiveness. The army would create predators because the alternative was to continue sending prey. The 33 candidates who survived the selection process at Camp Grant in late February 1918 had demonstrated they possessed the psychological raw material required for assault operations. What remained was to refine that material into tactical precision. The training that followed selection was fundamentally different from standard military instruction. Regular infantry training focused on teaching men to follow orders, maintain formation, and execute coordinated movements under officer control. Assault training focused on teaching men to operate independently, make instant tactical decisions, and kill efficiently in chaotic environments without external direction. The curriculum, developed by French advisors based on 3 years of operational experience, divided into 3 components: physical conditioning for extreme endurance, tactical training for small unit infiltration, and psychological hardening to eliminate residual hesitation. The physical component pushed candidates to their physiological limits. The training day began at 0400 and continued until 2200, with every hour filled with exhausting activity. Long-distance running with progressively heavier loads. Rope climbing and wall scaling until candidates' hands bled through their gloves. Hand-to-hand combat drills that left both participants bruised and gasping. The purpose was not merely to build strength, but to teach the body to continue functioning effectively while exhausted, hungry, cold, and in pain, conditions that would be constant in actual assault operations. Several candidates asked why the physical training was so much more severe than regular infantry preparation. Lieutenant Morrison's explanation was blunt. Regular infantry fought from fixed positions where they could rest, eat, and rotate to rear areas. Assault troops operated ahead of main lines, often for days at a time, with no resupply, no reinforcement, and no relief. They had to carry everything they needed: weapons, ammunition, food, water, explosives, and still maintain combat effectiveness after 60 hours without sleep. The physical training was not punishment. It was simulation of operational reality. 3 candidates dropped out during the physical conditioning phase, admitting they could not sustain the pace. They were returned to regular units. The remaining 30 continued to tactical training. The tactical component introduced candidates to infiltration techniques developed by German stormtroopers and refined by French assault units. The Doctrine rejected the linear tactics that had dominated warfare for centuries. Instead of advancing in organized lines, assault troops moved in small groups, typically 4 to 6 men, using terrain and suppression fire to advance through enemy defenses without being detected or engaged by the majority of defensive weapons. The technique required each man to make constant tactical decisions: when to move and when to freeze, which route to take through broken terrain, when to engage enemy positions and when to bypass them. These decisions had to be made instantly, without consultation, because stopping to confer meant losing momentum and becoming a target. Training exercises reinforced this autonomy. Candidates were sent into mock German defensive positions, trenches, bunkers, and barbed wire obstacles constructed exactly to German specifications, in groups of 4. They received only the most basic instructions: penetrate the position and capture a designated objective. No detailed plan, no step-by-step guidance. They had to figure out how to accomplish the missions using their own judgment. The results varied dramatically. Some groups became paralyzed without detailed orders, sitting in their starting positions and waiting for instructions that would never come. These groups failed. Other groups moved forward, but did so cautiously, advancing in textbook formations that would have been appropriate for parade grounds, but were suicidal in actual combat. These groups also failed. The groups that succeeded were those that immediately fragmented into pairs, used covering fire instinctively, and moved through the mock defenses with aggressive speed. They made mistakes, took wrong routes, exposed themselves unnecessarily, sometimes attacked positions that should have been bypassed. But they kept moving. They made decisions. They adapted when their initial plans failed. This was the essential characteristic the training was designed to cultivate: the capacity for autonomous tactical decision-making under stress. Regular infantry could execute complex maneuvers if properly led by competent officers. Assault troops had to execute complex maneuvers without officers, because officers died in the first 30 seconds of engagement. The tactical training phase lasted 3 weeks. By its conclusion, 4 more candidates had dropped out, unable to master the combination of physical endurance, technical proficiency, and autonomous decision-making required. 26 men remained. The final component of specialized training was psychological hardening, the systematic removal of any remaining hesitation about killing. This phase began with lecture sessions conducted by British veterans of assault operations. The veterans described, in clinical detail, what close-quarters combat actually entailed. The sounds a man made when bayoneted in the stomach. The smell of a trench after a grenade exploded in a confined space filled with human bodies. The sensation of hand-to-hand grappling with an enemy soldier. Both men exhausted, both trying to kill the other with knives or bare hands or rocks or whatever was available. The purpose of these lectures was not to frighten, but to inoculate. By describing the worst aspects of combat explicitly and repeatedly, the instructors aimed to reduce psychological shock when candidates encountered these realities in actual battle. But lectures could only accomplish so much. Final exercise in psychological hardening required candidates to experience simulated killing under maximally realistic conditions. The exercise took place in a replicated German trench system at night. Candidates entered individually, armed with a loaded rifle and live bayonet. Inside the trenches, instructors wearing heavy protective gear and face shields would attack without warning. The candidate's task was to respond with maximum force, to stab, strike, and grapple as if fighting for his life. What made the exercise psychologically effective was the addition of sensory realism. The trenches were filled with smoke. Recordings of artillery fire and screaming played at high volume. Animal blood had been splashed on the walls and floor. The instructors, when struck, would collapse and emit recorded sounds of dying men. The candidates knew intellectually that this was training. But in the darkness, noise, and chaos, their nervous systems could not distinguish simulation from reality. They experienced the visceral sensation of killing another human being. 23 candidates completed this exercise and demonstrated appropriate response. Immediate, overwhelming violence followed by rapid psychological recovery. 3 candidates broke down during or after the exercise. 1 vomited repeatedly after stabbing an instructor. 1 began crying and could not be calmed. 1 attacked with appropriate force, but then sat beside the killed instructor and refused to continue, appearing to enter a dissociative state. These 3 were removed from the program immediately. They had revealed a psychological limit that no amount of training could overcome. They could be taught to kill, but the act would break them. In actual combat, such men became casualties, not because they died, but because they ceased to function as soldiers. The 23 who remained were what the selection and training process had been designed to produce. They could endure extreme physical stress. They could make tactical decisions autonomously in chaotic conditions. They could commit violence efficiently and recover psychologically to commit it again. On March 31st, 1918, these 23 men graduated from the Camp Grant Assault Training Program. Similar programs at Fort Benjamin Harrison and Camp Lee had produced 21 and 18 graduates, respectively. 62 men total from an initial pool of 400. The attrition rate was catastrophic by conventional standards. 84% of candidates had been rejected or voluntarily withdrawn. But by the mathematics that governed assault warfare, the program was precisely calibrated. These 62 men represented the viable percentage of the male population capable of effective stormtrooper operations. Training more would have been wasteful. Accepting men with lower capabilities would have been fatal. What emerged from the Camp Grant program and its counterparts was not merely a training methodology, but a comprehensive doctrine for creating assault units. The American contribution to assault warfare theory was the systematization of what European armies had learned through trial and error. The doctrine rested on three foundational principles, each supported by statistical data compiled during the selection process. First principle: psychological suitability for assault operations exists in approximately 10 to 15% of the military-age male population and cannot be created through training. This was the most radical departure from traditional military thinking. For centuries, armies had operated on the assumption that any healthy man could be trained to be an effective soldier. The assault doctrine rejected this assumption entirely. It proposed instead that combat effectiveness, particularly in close-quarters killing, was a function of pre-existing psychological characteristics that training could refine, but not create. The Camp Grant data supported this conclusion. Of the initial 200 candidates, all physically fit, all having completed basic training, all volunteers who wanted to be selected, only 23 possessed the combination of aggression control, stress tolerance, and killing capacity required for assault operations. The remaining 177 were not cowards or failures. They were simply psychologically unsuited for a specific type of warfare. This distinction was critical. The rejected candidates returned to regular infantry units where most served with distinction. They could hold defensive positions, execute coordinated assaults under officer direction, and perform the hundreds of tasks required of conventional soldiers. What they could not do was operate independently in small groups, make instant life or death decisions without orders, and kill repeatedly at close range without psychological breakdown. The doctrine did not judge these men as inferior. It categorized them as unsuitable for a specialized role, just as a man might be unsuitable for submarine service due to claustrophobia, or unsuitable for aviation due to vertigo. The innovation was applying this logic to combat psychology. Second principle: selection efficiency improves dramatically when testing replicates actual combat stress as closely as possible. European armies had learned this lesson expensively. Early French assault units had been formed from volunteers who underwent conventional training, then sent into combat to see who would break. The attrition rate was horrific, not just from enemy action, but from psychological collapse. Men who had appeared brave and capable in training proved unable to function when required to kill at arm's length. The American approach inverted this process. By creating training conditions that replicated combat stress, darkness, noise, chaos, physical exhaustion, simulated killing, the program identified unsuitable candidates before they entered actual combat. This was not merely more humane, though it was more efficient. The mathematics was straightforward. Every unsuitable candidate sent into assault operations represented a cascade of costs. The cost of his equipment and specialized training. The cost of transporting him to France. The operational cost when he failed at the critical moment, potentially compromising his entire unit. The cost of casualty evacuation if he broke psychologically and had to be removed from the front. The cost of treating his psychological trauma. Compared to these costs, the expense of intensive selection training was minimal. It cost the Army 6 weeks and modest resources to determine that a man was unsuitable. It cost infinitely more to discover the same fact under enemy fire. Third principle. The capacity for controlled aggression, the ability to toggle between extreme violence and calm discipline, is the single most reliable predictor of assault effectiveness. This principle emerged from analyzing which specific tests most accurately predicted combat performance. French liaison officers provided data from actual assault operations, tracking which soldiers had performed effectively and correlating that performance with their behavior during training exercises. The pattern was clear. Physical strength, endurance, marksmanship, tactical knowledge. None of these factors reliably predicted success in assault operations. Many physically elite soldiers failed in close combat. Many excellent marksmen could not pull the trigger on a human target at point-blank range. The characteristic that consistently predicted success was the capacity to deliver maximum violence when required, then immediately transition to controlled, disciplined behavior when the violent action was complete. This quality appeared in the training exercises where candidates had to attack mannequins with full force, then immediately perform tasks requiring fine motor control. Men who could make this transition had, without exception, performed effectively in subsequent combat simulations. The psychological mechanism underlying this capacity remained unclear. Some researchers proposed it reflected unusual neurological wiring that allowed rapid modulation of the sympathetic nervous system. Others suggested early childhood experiences that taught violence control. Still others argued it was simply a personality trait distributed randomly across the population. The doctrine did not require understanding the mechanism. It only required identifying men who possessed the trait. The toggle test, rapid alternation between violent action and precision tasks, had proven reliable for this purpose. These 3 principles formed the core of American assault selection doctrine. They were documented in training manuals, taught to officer candidates, and implemented across multiple camps as the program expanded in spring 1918. But doctrine alone could not answer the question that haunted every officer involved in the selection process. What kind of men were they creating? Captain Holbrook had never considered himself a philosopher. He was a career military officer, educated at West Point in tactics and logistics, experienced in commanding men under discipline. But the selection program had forced him to confront questions that no military textbook addressed. On April 3, 1918, he sat in his office reviewing the psychological profiles of the 23 graduates. Each file contained detailed observations compiled over 6 weeks of intensive testing. The patterns were undeniable. 17 of the 23 had histories of physical violence before military service. Not criminal violence necessarily, though 3 had assault charges that had been dropped when they enlisted. But documented incidents, schoolyard fights that resulted in severe injuries, bar brawls. One man had been dismissed from a police force for excessive force during an arrest. Another had been banned from amateur boxing for repeatedly ignoring referees' commands to stop hitting downed opponents. 14 showed what the psychological evaluators termed limited empathy response. When shown photographs of wounded soldiers, They demonstrated no measurable emotional reaction, no elevated heart rate, no pupil dilation, no facial expressions suggesting distress. They looked at images of human suffering with the same flat effect they brought to looking at images of machinery or landscapes. 9 had what civilian psychologists would have classified as antisocial personality traits. They formed no close friendships during training. They expressed no concern when fellow candidates were injured. They showed no signs of experiencing guilt, regret, or moral conflict about any of their actions during the program. This was the uncomfortable truth that the selection process had revealed. The psychological characteristics that made men effective assault troops were the same characteristics that, in civilian society, would mark them as psychologically abnormal or dangerous. The military was identifying men who experienced minimal emotional resistance to killing, then training them to be more effective killers, then deploying them in situations where killing was not just permitted but required. The program was not teaching normal men to overcome their natural reluctance to commit violence. It was finding men who had no such reluctance and weaponizing that characteristic. Holbrook understood the tactical necessity. When German stormtroopers attacked through smoke and darkness with grenades and sharpened trench tools, mercy was not a virtue, but a fatal liability. The men who hesitated, who experienced normal human empathy, even toward an enemy trying to kill them, died. The men who killed without hesitation survived and accomplished the mission. But understanding the tactical necessity did not resolve the moral question. Was the army creating monsters? The French had confronted this question earlier. General Pétain had written candidly about the psychological cost of assault warfare. French assault troops, he noted, demonstrated alarming rates of post-combat behavioral problems. Many became violent during rest periods, picking fights with other soldiers or civilians. Some showed what psychiatrists termed addiction to combat excitement. They became psychologically dependent on the adrenaline surge of close-quarters fighting and grew depressed and unstable when removed from combat. A significant percentage could not successfully reintegrate into civilian society after the war. The British had observed similar patterns. British assault troops had earned a reputation for both extraordinary combat effectiveness and extraordinary indiscipline. They ignored regulations, disrespected officers, committed crimes during occupation duty. One British colonel described his assault unit as magnificent in battle and ungovernable everywhere else. These were not temporary problems that would resolve when the war ended. These were indications that the selection process was identifying men with fundamental psychological differences from the general population, and that combat experience was reinforcing those differences rather than normalizing them. The American program, with its systematic approach and detailed psychological documentation, was making these patterns undeniable. The Army was deliberately selecting for traits that civilian society would consider pathological. It was creating elite units composed largely of men who, in peacetime, would be considered psychologically abnormal or criminally dangerous. Captain Duval, the French liaison officer, had addressed this concern directly during a conversation with Holbrook in late March. His perspective, shaped by 3 years of European combat, was bluntly pragmatic. "You are worried about creating killers," Duval had said. "But war is about killing. You can pretend otherwise, speak of honor and duty and defense of civilization. But when a soldier enters a trench where Germans wait with grenades and knives, all the noble language becomes irrelevant. Either he kills them efficiently, or they kill him. There is no third option. We are not creating monsters," Duval continued. "We are identifying men who already possess certain characteristics and placing them in a role where those characteristics are valuable rather than destructive. In civilian society, a man who feels no remorse about violence is dangerous. In assault warfare, he is essential. The question is not whether such men should exist. They exist regardless of what we do. The question is whether we use them effectively or waste them. Holbrook understood the logic. But logic did not eliminate discomfort. The files on his desk described men who could beat another human being to death with mechanical efficiency and feel nothing afterward. Men who viewed killing not as a tragic necessity, but as a task to be executed competently. Men who, by any civilian psychological standard, should not be given weapons and authority to use them. Yet these were precisely the men the war required. And the alternative to using them was sending psychologically normal soldiers. Men who hesitated, who felt empathy, who experienced moral conflict about killing, into situations where those very characteristics guaranteed their deaths. The mathematics offered no comfort, only clarity. A psychologically normal soldier in an assault role was likely to die or break psychologically, becoming a casualty either way. A man with limited empathy and high aggression was likely to survive and accomplish the mission. From a purely operational perspective, the choice was obvious. But Holbrook could not escape the knowledge that the program he was implementing would have consequences extending far beyond the war. The 62 men graduating from the American assault training programs were being trained and equipped to kill with maximum efficiency. When the war ended, and eventually it would end, these men would return to civilian society carrying that training, that experience, and those psychological characteristics. Some would reintegrate successfully, channeling their aggression into productive pursuits. But the European data suggested most would not. Most would struggle with civilian life, finding it boring and meaningless compared to the intensity of combat. Some would turn to violence, unable to function without the adrenaline surge they had come to require. Some would simply be unable to form normal human connections, having spent formative months surrounded by death and having learned to suppress every emotional response that might slow their trigger finger. The Army was creating a generation of men psychologically optimized for killing, then releasing them into a peacetime society unprepared to handle them. This was the hidden cost of the selection program, not the 84% who were rejected, but the 16% who were accepted. The rejected would return to normal military service and eventually to normal civilian lives. The accepted would be transformed into something that could not easily transform back. Yet for all the moral complexity, the program continued to expand. By May 1918, 6 additional training camps had implemented assault selection programs based on the Camp Grant model. The mathematics of war did not pause for philosophical reflection. The expansion was driven by brutal operational necessity. American forces in France were entering combat in significant numbers, and early engagements had confirmed what European advisors had predicted. Units composed of conventionally trained soldiers suffered catastrophic casualties when attempting assault operations. Units incorporating even small numbers of specially selected assault troops performed dramatically better. The data from the first American assault operation at Cantigny in late May was particularly revealing. 2 companies attacked German positions. 1 company was conventional infantry. The other had been reinforced with a 12-man assault section composed of Camp Grant graduates. The conventional company suffered 67% casualties and failed to capture its objective. The reinforced company suffered 31% casualties and captured its objective within 2 hours. The assault section accounted for 73% of confirmed German casualties, despite representing only 8% of the attacking force. The mathematics was irrefutable. Assault-selected troops were, per capita, approximately 9 times more effective in close-quarters combat than conventional soldiers. They accomplished missions that would otherwise require much larger forces, and did so with lower friendly casualties overall. Not because they were less likely to be killed individually, but because their efficiency reduced the time units spent exposed to enemy fire. This efficiency translated directly into strategic capability. General Pershing's staff calculated that incorporating assault-selected troops into attacking battalions improved operational success rates by 40 to 60%, while reducing overall casualties by 20 to 30%. These were not marginal improvements. These were force multipliers that fundamentally altered what American units could accomplish. The decision to expand the program was therefore not primarily moral, but mathematical. The Army could continue using conventional tactics and suffer higher casualties while accomplishing less. Or it could implement systematic assault selection and gain decisive tactical advantages. Officers who had moral reservations about the selection process, and many did, found those reservations difficult to maintain when the alternative was watching conventionally trained soldiers die in failed assaults. The expansion followed industrial principles. The selection process was standardized across all camps, with identical tests administered in identical sequence. Candidates were processed through the system like raw material through a manufacturing pipeline. Input: volunteers with basic training. Output: assault troops capable of specific performance metrics. Waste product: soldiers returned to conventional units. By August 1918, the American Army had processed approximately 3,000 candidates through assault selection programs. 487 had graduated, a consistent 16% success rate across all camps. These numbers matched European experience almost exactly, confirming that the psychological distribution of assault-suitable traits was consistent across different populations. But the industrial efficiency of the selection process could not eliminate the human reality it revealed. The program was demonstrating, with uncomfortable precision, that the capacity for effective combat violence was not evenly distributed. Most men could not be trained to kill efficiently at close range, regardless of how much time and resources were invested in training them. A small minority could kill with mechanical precision and suffer no psychological consequences. This was not the reality that democratic societies preferred to acknowledge. The mythology of citizen soldiers held that any free man, given proper training and motivation, could defend his nation effectively. The assault selection program revealed this mythology as false. Effective combat soldiers, particularly for specialized assault roles, were not created through training. They were identified through testing that revealed pre-existing psychological characteristics. The implications extended beyond military doctrine. If effective combat violence required psychological traits found in only 15% of the population, then modern warfare was fundamentally incompatible with mass citizen armies. The Industrial Revolution had transformed warfare into a contest of specialized capabilities: technological, logistical, and human. Just as modern factories required specialized workers rather than generalized craftsmen, modern assault warfare required specialized soldiers rather than generalized infantry. This realization was transforming military organization across all combatant nations. The German army, which had pioneered systematic assault selection, was restructuring its entire infantry doctrine around the distinction between conventional soldiers and assault troops. The French were creating permanent assault battalions that would be maintained even after the war. The British were establishing criteria for assault selection that would be incorporated into peacetime recruitment. The Americans, arriving late to the war, but with characteristic systematic efficiency, were documenting the entire process with unprecedented thoroughness. American military psychologists were analyzing every aspect of selection, creating statistical models of psychological suitability, developing standardized tests that could be administered efficiently at scale. What emerged from this analysis was not merely a military program, but a comprehensive theory of combat psychology. The theory held that combat effectiveness was a function of specific, measurable psychological traits. These traits could be identified through systematic testing. Men possessing these traits should be concentrated in specialized units. Men lacking these traits should be assigned to roles that did not require close-quarters killing. This was industrial logic applied to human material. And like all industrial logic, it was brutally efficient and morally uncomfortable. The focus of the assault selection program was naturally on the men who succeeded, the 16% who demonstrated the psychological capacity for effective stormtrooper operations. But the program also generated data about the 84% who were rejected, and that data was, in its own way, equally significant. The rejected candidates fell into distinct psychological categories, each revealing something about the distribution of combat-relevant traits in the general population. The largest category, approximately 42% of initial candidates, were men who possessed adequate physical capability and tactical intelligence, but could not overcome psychological resistance to violence. These men performed well in conventional training. They could march, shoot targets, execute tactical maneuvers. But when required to commit simulated violence against human-shaped targets, they hesitated or pulled their strikes. This category included many men from religious backgrounds, educated men, men from stable families with strong moral instruction. They had been taught since childhood that violence was wrong, that killing was sin, that conflicts should be resolved through dialogue and law. This moral education had shaped their psychology at a fundamental level. They could intellectually understand that war required killing, but their nervous systems could not execute the action without overwhelming psychological resistance. The selection program demonstrated that this resistance could not be eliminated through training or indoctrination. These men could be ordered to attack, threatened with court-martial for refusal, subjected to intensive conditioning. But when confronted with the actual moment of killing, even simulated killing in a training exercise, their hands shook. Their strikes were tentative. Their bodies physically refused to commit maximum violence. In conventional military doctrine, these men would have been considered failures, perhaps even cowards. The assault selection doctrine recognized them as something different, psychologically unsuitable for a specific role. They could still serve effectively in defensive positions, artillery crews, logistics units, or any of dozens of roles that did not require close-quarters killing. Their unsuitability for assault operations did not indicate overall military uselessness. The second category, approximately 26%, were men who could commit violence but could not control it. These men attacked aggressively during training exercises, but their aggression was chaotic rather than directed. They struck wildly, exhausted themselves quickly, and could not transition from violent action to calm discipline. This category included men with histories of uncontrolled anger, men who had been involved in bar fights and street brawls, men whose violence was reactive rather than instrumental. In civilian society, these men were often considered dangerous. In military context, they were unsuitable for assault operations because uncontrolled aggression was as dangerous as no aggression. Effective assault troops had to kill efficiently, quick, precise strikes that neutralized targets with minimum expenditure of energy and time. They had to move through enemy positions methodically, clearing each position completely before advancing. They had to maintain enough cognitive function to assess tactical situations while experiencing extreme adrenaline surge. Men with uncontrolled aggression could not do this. They would charge into a trench, attack the first enemy they encountered with exhausting fury, and either either be killed by a second enemy they had ignored or exhaust themselves so completely they became ineffective. The selection exercises revealed this pattern repeatedly. Men who attacked with wild, uncontrolled ferocity consistently failed subsequent tests requiring sustained combat effectiveness. The third category, approximately 16%, were men who broke psychologically under sustained stress. These men often performed well in initial exercises. But as the program progressed, as sleep deprivation accumulated, as physical exhaustion mounted, as the exercises became more realistic and disturbing, they reached a psychological limit and collapsed. Some broke suddenly, experiencing panic attacks, uncontrolled crying, or acute anxiety. Others deteriorated gradually, becoming withdrawn, non-responsive, unable to process instructions. A few experienced what psychiatrists termed dissociative episodes, where they appeared to mentally separate from their surroundings and became unable to function. What the selection program revealed about this category was particularly significant. The breaking point could not be predicted from initial performance. Some men who appeared strong and capable in early exercises broke in later weeks. Some who struggled initially demonstrated unexpected resilience. The only reliable way to identify men who would break was to push them to their limit and observe what happened. This finding justified the intensity and duration of the selection program. 6 weeks of severe stress testing was not excessive sadism, but necessary assessment. Men who would break under training conditions would certainly break under combat conditions. Identifying them before deployment saved their lives and the lives of men who would have depended on them. The final category, less than 1%, were men who demonstrated concerning levels of uncontrolled aggression or sadistic behavior. These men not only attacked aggressively, but appeared to enjoy inflicting pain. They struck harder than tactically necessary. They continued attacking after targets were neutralized. Some made comments suggesting they found violence pleasurable rather than merely acceptable. These men were removed from the program immediately, not because they lacked combat effectiveness, but because they could not be reliably controlled. Military necessity required men who could kill without hesitation. But it also required men who would stop killing when ordered. Men who derived pleasure from violence were unreliable. They might continue attacking against orders, might commit atrocities that would undermine discipline and create political problems, might be as dangerous to their own side as to the enemy. This category was small, but significant. It demonstrated that there was a spectrum of violence capacity, and both ends of the spectrum were unsuitable for military service. Men who could not bring themselves to kill were unsuitable. Men who enjoyed killing were also unsuitable. The 16% who were selected fell in the narrow middle range. Men who could kill efficiently without either psychological resistance or psychological pleasure. By October 1918, approximately 800 men had graduated from American assault selection programs. Their psychological profiles, compiled from 6 weeks of intensive observation and testing, revealed consistent characteristics. Stress tolerance. All graduates demonstrated exceptional resistance to psychological stress. They maintained cognitive function under conditions, sleep deprivation, physical exhaustion, sensory overload, simulated combat chaos, that caused most candidates to deteriorate. Their performance under stress was not merely adequate, but often improved, as if stress focused rather than degraded their capabilities. Psychological evaluators noted this was not simply a matter of toughness or determination. Some men eliminated from the program had demonstrated extraordinary determination, but still broke under sustained stress. The graduates appeared to process stress differently at a neurological level. Where most men experience stress as degrading and overwhelming, the graduates experienced it as energizing and focusing. Aggression control. All graduates could toggle between extreme violence and calm discipline with minimal transition time. This was the single most reliable predictor of selection success. During exercises requiring rapid alternation between violent action and precision tasks, graduates consistently outperformed other candidates by wide margins. The mechanism underlying this capability remained unclear, but the behavioral pattern was distinct. When instructed to attack, graduates delivered maximum force strikes with immediate explosive intensity. When the violent action was complete, they could instantly slow their breathing, steady their hands, and perform tasks requiring fine motor control. Most other candidates required minutes to recover from violent exertion before attempting precision work. Graduates required seconds. Emotional flatness. Most graduates demonstrated limited emotional range in general. They were neither cheerful nor depressed, neither anxious nor confident in extreme ways. They maintained a consistent, effective baseline regardless of circumstances. This emotional flatness extended to situations that provoked strong reactions in most men. Witnessing injury, experiencing physical pain, facing life-threatening scenarios in training. Psychological evaluators debated whether this flatness was a pre-existing trait or a learned response to early life experiences. Some graduates described childhoods involving significant trauma or violence that might have taught emotional suppression as a survival mechanism. Others reported unremarkable childhoods, suggesting the trait might be innate. Regardless of origin, the trait was tactically valuable. Men who did not experience strong emotional reactions to disturbing stimuli were less likely to freeze, panic, or make impulsive decisions under combat stress. They could assess situations and take appropriate action regardless of how disturbing those situations were. Social isolation. Approximately 2/3 of graduates formed few close relationships during training. They cooperated effectively with other candidates on tactical exercises, but showed little interest in social interaction during rest periods. They ate alone, wrote few letters, participated minimally in the informal social bonding that characterized most military units. This social isolation concerned some officers, who worried that men without strong unit bonds would be unreliable in combat. But French and British advisors reported the opposite pattern. Assault troops who were socially isolated actually performed more reliably in combat than those with strong personal attachments. They made tactical decisions based on mission requirements rather than desire to protect friends. They did not hesitate when ordered to advance, even if it meant leaving wounded comrades behind. The mathematics of assault warfare favored men who viewed their teammates as tactical assets rather than personal friends. Emotional attachments created hesitation. Men who felt nothing risked nothing emotionally and therefore acted with optimal tactical efficiency. Comfort with violence. All graduates shared one characteristic that distinguished them most clearly from the general population. They experienced no apparent psychological distress from committing simulated violence. Where most candidates showed visible signs of stress, elevated breathing, trembling hands, expressions of concern or regret. After exercises involving simulated killing, graduates showed none. When interviewed about their experience of the exercises, graduates typically described them in mechanical terms. They had neutralized targets. They had executed techniques. They had accomplished objectives. They did not describe feeling anything about having done so. The simulated killing was simply a task they had performed, no more emotionally significant than any other physical activity. This characteristic was, more than any other, what the selection program was designed to identify. The capacity to kill without psychological consequence was not teachable. A man either possessed this capacity or he did not. The selection program's function was to identify which men possessed it, because these were the only men who could survive psychologically in roles requiring repeated close-quarters killing. The effectiveness of assault-selected troops in actual combat exceeded even optimistic predictions. By November 1918, American divisions incorporating assault units were achieving breakthrough rates 3 to 4 times higher than divisions using conventional organization. Casualty rates in assault operations were 40% lower when assault-selected troops led attacks. These results transformed American military doctrine permanently. What had begun as an experimental program became official policy. In the final months of the war, the U.S. Army established permanent assault battalions that would be maintained in peacetime. Selection criteria were codified in official training manuals. Officer candidates were taught the principles of psychological selection as core military science. The transformation extended beyond assault troops specifically. The fundamental principle that combat roles should be filled based on psychological suitability rather than general training began influencing all aspects of military organization. If assault operations required specific psychological traits, perhaps other specialized roles did as well. Perhaps pilots, submarine crews, intelligence officers, and commanders all required distinct psychological profiles that could be identified through systematic testing. This represented a philosophical transformation in how armies understood human capability. For centuries, military doctrine had assumed that soldiers were fundamentally interchangeable. Any healthy man could be trained for any role. Individual variation in capability was considered minor and manageable through discipline and leadership. The assault selection program demolished this assumption. It demonstrated that individuals varied enormously in their suitability for specific combat roles, and that these variations reflected fundamental psychological differences that could not be eliminated through training. The efficient military organization was not one that trained all soldiers identically, but one that identified each soldier's psychological strengths and assigned them to roles matching those strengths. This was industrial logic applied to human organization. Modern factories had learned that productivity increased when workers were matched to tasks suited to their specific capabilities rather than trained generically. Modern warfare required the same principle. Soldiers should be tested, categorized, and assigned based on psychological assessment rather than arbitrary selection. The implications were profound. If military effectiveness required psychological specialization, then mass mobilization, the practice of conscripting entire male populations and training them as generic infantry, was fundamentally inefficient. The majority of conscripts would be assigned to roles they were psychologically unsuited for, reducing overall effectiveness while increasing casualties. The efficient alternative was selective recruitment combined with systematic testing. Rather than conscripting millions and training them identically, armies should recruit smaller numbers, test them thoroughly, and assign them to specialized roles based on demonstrated psychological capabilities. This logic would drive military organization throughout the 20th century. The concept of psychological selection that began with assault troops would expand to pilot selection, submarine qualification, special operations, and eventually to intelligence services and command positions. By the end of the century, most advanced militaries would operate on the principle that effective soldiers were not created through training, but identified through testing that revealed pre-existing psychological traits. The men who marched across the parade ground at Camp Grant in January 1918, 200 exemplary soldiers in perfect formation, represented the last generation of military organization based on the assumption that soldiers were fundamentally interchangeable. The 23 men who graduated from the assault selection program represented the future, specialized, psychologically optimized for specific roles, sorted by capacity rather than trained to generic standards. The war ended on November 11, 1918. Of the approximately 800 men who graduated from American assault selection programs, 632 survived to armistice. Their combat performance had been exceptional. They had accomplished objectives that conventional forces could not, with lower casualties overall despite being deployed in the most dangerous operations. But survival in combat did not mean survival psychologically. The characteristic that had made these men effective assault troops, limited emotional response to violence, also made their reintegration into peacetime society profoundly difficult. The data from demobilization medical examinations was sobering. 41% of assault program graduates reported experiencing what psychiatrists termed absence of purpose in civilian life, a sense that nothing in peacetime held meaning or interest. 37% reported difficulty forming or maintaining personal relationships. 23% had been arrested at least once within 2 years of demobilization, typically for assault or violent behavior. These statistics were significantly worse than those for conventional combat veterans. Men who had experienced traumatic combat but had not been selected for psychological violence capacity showed different patterns. They suffered from nightmares, anxiety, and what would later be termed post-traumatic stress. But they could typically reintegrate into civilian society given time and support. Assault program graduates showed different pathology. They did not experience nightmares or anxiety. They experienced profound disconnection from civilian life. One graduate, interviewed by a military psychiatrist in 1920, described the problem clearly. "I don't feel anything anymore. I watch people get excited or upset about things that seem trivial. I can't relate to their concerns. The only time I felt alive was in combat, when everything had immediate consequences. Everything here feels fake." This was the hidden cost of the selection program. By identifying and concentrating men whose psychology was optimized for violence, the military had created a cohort who could never fully return to peacetime society. They had been effective soldiers precisely because they were psychologically different from the general population. That difference, which had been a tactical asset during war, became a profound liability during peace. Some graduates found successful adaptations. Police forces and security companies employed significant numbers, providing roles where their capacity for controlled aggression remained valuable. Some went into professions requiring stress tolerance and emotional control: mining, commercial fishing, firefighting. Others found meaning in criminal activity, channeling their capabilities into violent crime when legal outlets proved unsatisfying. But many simply drifted, unable to find purpose in a world that had no use for their particular capabilities. The capacity for efficient violence, so desperately needed during war, became merely disturbing during peace. Society had no framework for understanding or accommodating men who could kill without psychological consequence. They were simultaneously veterans to be honored and individuals to be feared. The assault selection program that began at Camp Grant in January 1918 represented more than a tactical innovation. It represented the moment when modern warfare explicitly acknowledged what previous generations had refused to admit: that effective combat killing required psychological characteristics found in only a minority of the population, and that military efficiency demanded identifying that minority rather than pretending all men were equally capable of violence. This acknowledgement transformed warfare permanently. Before 1918, military doctrine had operated on democratic assumptions. Any citizen could become a soldier. Any soldier could be trained for any role. Individual variation existed but was considered manageable through discipline and leadership. The assault selection program demonstrated these assumptions were false. Most men could not be trained to kill efficiently at close range, regardless of how much discipline was imposed. The minority who could were psychologically different at a fundamental level. This reality was uncomfortable for democratic societies that preferred to believe in human equality. But the mathematics of industrial warfare did not accommodate comfortable beliefs. German stormtroopers selected for psychological violence capacity killed at 9 times the rate of conventional soldiers. American assault troops selected through systematic testing achieved similar ratios. These were not marginal improvements subject to debate. These were order of magnitude differences that determined which armies won and which lost. The choice facing military establishments was stark. Acknowledge that combat effectiveness required psychological specialization and implement systematic selection, or maintain egalitarian fictions and watch soldiers die in disproportionate numbers. Every major military chose the former. By 1920, psychological selection had become standard doctrine in German, French, British, and American armies. The principles established at Camp Grant, that combat roles should be filled based on psychological testing, that training could refine but not create fundamental capabilities, that military efficiency required matching individuals to roles suited to their psychological characteristics, would govern military organization throughout the 20th century. Special operations forces, intelligence services, pilot selection, submarine qualification, nuclear weapons handling, and eventually command positions would all incorporate systematic psychological testing based on recognition that not all individuals were equally suited for all roles. But the program's legacy extended beyond military doctrine. It established a template for thinking about human capability that influenced fields far removed from warfare. If military effectiveness required identifying psychological traits through systematic testing, perhaps other institutions should do the same. Corporations began using psychological assessment for management, selection. Police forces implemented testing for special units. Intelligence agencies built entire recruitment systems around psychological profiling. The fundamental principle was always the same. Human capabilities are not equally distributed, and organizational efficiency requires identifying and placing individuals based on assessment of their specific capacities, rather than assuming generic interchangeability. This was the mathematics of industrial society applied to human organization. Just as factories had learned that productivity increased when workers were matched to tasks suited to their capabilities, modern institutions learned that effectiveness increased when individuals were selected for roles matching their psychological characteristics. The assault selection program at Camp Grant was where this principle first achieved systematic implementation in military context. 200 men had marched across the parade ground in perfect formation. 23 had been identified as psychologically suitable for assault operations. The mathematics was brutal. 88% rejected, 12% selected. But the mathematics worked. Those 23 men, deployed to France, accomplished objectives that conventional forces of 200 could not. This was the calculus that would define modern warfare. Not mass against mass, not courage against courage, but specialized capability against specialized capability, with victory going to whichever side more efficiently identified, trained, and deployed individuals whose psychological characteristics matched operational requirements. The men rejected from the program, the 84% who returned to conventional units, were not failures. They were statistical evidence of what the program had been designed to measure: that the capacity for effective combat violence existed in a minority of the population and could be identified through systematic testing. Their rejection was not a judgment of worth, but a recognition of unsuitability for a specific role. The men who graduated, The 16% who demonstrated stress tolerance, aggression control, emotional flatness, and capacity for violence without psychological consequence were not heroes in any traditional sense. They were individuals whose psychological characteristics happened to match the requirements of industrial-age assault warfare. Their effectiveness was not a moral quality, but a functional match between psychological traits and operational demands. But effectiveness was what the mathematics of war required. Pershing needed forces that could break German defenses. German defenses could only be broken by troops capable of close-quarters killing without hesitation. Such capability existed in approximately 15% of the male population. Therefore, operational success required identifying that 15% and concentrating them in assault units. The logic was irrefutable. The moral implications were disturbing. The tactical results were undeniable. By armistice, American assault units had participated in every major offensive operation of 1918. At Belleau Wood, assault-selected Marines had cleared German positions that conventional forces had failed to penetrate. At Saint-Mihiel, assault troops had led the breakthrough that eliminated the salient. In the Meuse-Argonne offensive, assault battalions had penetrated German defensive lines that had held against larger conventional forces. These operations succeeded not because American soldiers were braver or more patriotic than their European counterparts. They were not. They succeeded because the American Army had systematically implemented lessons that European armies had learned through 3 years of catastrophic casualties. The lesson was simple. Modern assault warfare required psychological specialization, and psychological specialization required systematic selection based on testing rather than training based on assumption. The cost of learning this lesson had been enormous. The European powers had discovered through trial and error what psychological traits assault warfare required, sacrificing hundreds of thousands of men in the process. France had lost 163,000 at Verdun. Britain had lost 420,000 at the Somme. These casualties reflected not merely German defensive strength, but the fundamental mismatch between the psychological capabilities of mass conscript armies and the psychological demands of assault operations. The American contribution was systematizing the lesson. Rather than learning through combat casualties, the U.S. had learned through intensive selection testing. Rather than identifying suitable assault troops by observing who survived combat, Americans had identified them through exercises that simulated combat stress. The result was the same: identification of the psychological minority capable of effective assault operations. But the cost was orders of magnitude lower. This was American industrial efficiency applied to military organization. European armies had developed assault doctrine through artisanal methods: trial and error, observation of survivors, gradual refinement. Americans had industrialized the process: systematic testing, statistical analysis, standardized procedures replicable across multiple camps. The outcome was predictable. By November 1918, American assault units were, per capita, as effective as German stormtroopers who had 3 years more combat experience. This was not because Americans were superior soldiers, but because Americans had created superior selection methodology. The psychological traits required for assault operations existed at similar frequencies across different populations. The competitive advantage came from efficiency of identification and training. In December 1918, Captain James Holbrook submitted his final report on the Camp Grant Assault Selection Program. The report contained detailed statistical analysis, documentation of selection procedures, and recommendations for permanent implementation. It also contained a section that was quietly removed before the report was distributed to other camps. That section addressed what Holbrook termed the fundamental moral question: whether democratic societies could ethically implement selection systems that explicitly identified and weaponized psychological characteristics most societies considered disturbing or pathological. Holbrook's conclusion was that the question was irrelevant. War was not an ethical enterprise. It was a mathematical enterprise. The side that more efficiently converted resources, industrial, logistical, human, into combat effectiveness won. The side that maintained ethical scruples at the cost of effectiveness lost. The assault selection program worked. It identified men who could kill efficiently and repeatedly without psychological breakdown. It concentrated those men in specialized units. It deployed those units in roles requiring their specific capabilities. The result was measurable tactical advantage that translated into strategic success. Whether this process was ethical was a question for philosophers. Whether it was effective was a question for military professionals. And the answer to the second question was undeniably yes. This was the uncomfortable truth that the assault selection program had revealed, and that military establishments worldwide would subsequently acknowledge. Effective modern warfare required identifying and utilizing psychological characteristics that peacetime societies preferred to suppress or deny. The capacity for controlled, efficient violence without empathy or remorse was a trait that civilian society considered pathological. Military necessity considered it essential. The program had demonstrated that this trait could be identified through systematic testing, that it existed in approximately 15% of the military-age male population, and that concentrating men possessing this trait in specialized units produced order-of-magnitude improvements in combat effectiveness. Every military that studied the American assault selection program reached the same conclusion. Psychological specialization was not optional, but mandatory for competitive effectiveness. By 1925, psychological testing for specialized combat roles had become standard practice in every major military establishment worldwide. The mathematics had spoken. War was not about courage or patriotism or noble sacrifice. War was about identifying which men could kill most efficiently and placing them in positions where they could kill most effectively. Everything else, the rhetoric of honor, the ceremonies of valor, the monuments to sacrifice, was civilization's attempt to make acceptable what was fundamentally brutal. The assault selection program had stripped away that rhetoric and revealed the mechanism underneath. 200 men march in formation. Tests identify the 23 whose psychology is optimized for killing. Those 23 are concentrated, trained, and deployed to kill. They kill efficiently. Operations succeed. Casualties decrease overall, even though individual risk for assault troops increases. This was the mathematics of industrial warfare. Not pleasant. Not ethical by any conventional standard, but undeniably effective. And effectiveness, in the calculus of war, was the only metric that mattered. The men who graduated from Camp Grant in March 1918. Robert Keller, Thomas Chen, and 21 others whose names appeared in no newspaper accounts, who received no medals for their psychological characteristics, who simply demonstrated the capacity to kill without breaking, represented the future of warfare. Not the mythology of citizen soldiers, not the romance of courage and honor, but the brutal reality of psychological optimization for violence. They were what modern warfare required, what democratic societies were reluctant to acknowledge requiring, what the mathematics of war made undeniable. The program that created them would never be publicly celebrated. Its principles would be quietly incorporated into military doctrine and implemented across generations. The uncomfortable truth it revealed, that effective combat required psychological traits distributed unequally and disturbing to contemplate, would remain largely unspoken. But every military professional who studied the data reached the same conclusion. Captain Holbrook had been correct. The question was not whether selecting for psychological capacity to kill was ethical. The question was whether armies would implement such selection efficiently or learn its necessity through casualties. The mathematics permitted no other answer.